Welcome to Faith and Freedom, an audio feature produced by the Wagner Faith and Freedom Center located on the campus of Spring Arbor University. The Wagner Faith and Freedom Center serves as the nation's academic voice for faith, family, and freedom. And now here's your host for Faith and Freedom, Professor William Wagner.
Welcome to Faith and Freedom. I'm your host, Professor William Wagner. You know, we always look at the hard cultural issues through the lens of faith, and we're going to do that again today. We're going to return to an issue we've discussed here before, and that is the situation in Nigeria, and especially the situation for the Christian people living there. But we're going to try and get to a deeper analysis of it, you know, because a lot of folks just say, hey, this is just about Christian persecution. Other folks say, no, this is just about, you know, some different demographics and geography. And it truly is a very complicated issue. But we're going to get to the bottom of it today. And I'm going to turn this over to our Chief Operating Officer, Salvatore Biondo.
Thanks, Will. Well, first of all, I just want to thank both of you for coming on today to record this episode with us. I know that for you as a student and you as a professor, this is a crazy time at the end of the semester to be doing anything but the essentials. So Will and I are both really appreciative that you've both come on and decided to discuss this topic with us. I'm going to start my introduction with you, Omoneh. So Omoneh here is a senior at Spring Arbor University. She studies both sociology and international business. She's a senior, as I said before. She's originally from Nigeria, and as I understand it, she's deeply interested in discussing the broader sociological impacts that are affecting different communities in her home country and the state as a whole. Our second guest today is Professor Joseph Solis-Mullen, a professor of history and political economy here at Spring Arbor University. He's also a Ralph Raico Fellow and frequently contributes to both the Mises Institute and the Libertarian Institute. Last year in 2024, he ran as the Libertarian candidate in Michigan's U.S. Senate race, winning the confidence of tens of thousands of voters. Of course, I know him best as my old comparative government teacher, in which his class taught me a 2-hour lecture on the current situation, the economy, and the history of the country of Nigeria. And of course, we all know Will Wagner, who worked as a federal judge and a U.S. diplomat working in West Africa. And so he's very skilled on this topic as well. And with that said, I want to hand things off to Professor Solis-Mullen to kind of begin our exploration and talk about the historical forces behind today's crisis. So thank you.
Sure, Sal. And one thing I appreciate about you and Will's approach is an attempt to properly contextualize what's going on here, because it would be great if we could just tell a very simple black and white story, but in fact, this is actually quite complicated and goes back several centuries. So let's start with sort of pre-colonial, what we call Nigeria, which was not a unitary state. It wasn't a unitary polity. There were all sorts of different kingdoms, city-states, even stateless sort of tribal peoples, herders, pastoral peoples moving around. So there was a series of kingdoms, especially in the north, that were very tied into a North African trade, which was tied into Central Asian trade. Really, the important part of our story starts really in the 19th century when you had the creation of a caliphate in the north of the country, which unified it and introduced Sharia into what we would call secular political law. But in the South, you started to have very, I'm going to use the word aggressive. I don't mean aggressive in like a predatory sense, but there had been Christianity in the coastal areas of what we call Nigeria, but it was Portuguese Catholicism, and it wasn't very evangelical. There was not a strong missionary impulse. When the British step into the scene in the early 19th century, this changes. And Christianity starts to spread in the South, which is also very tied to commerce. So we have two different types of societies already very clearly emerging. A northern pastoral society that is Sharia and Islam. It's a caliphate. And in the South, you have a much more cosmopolitan, trade-driven, tolerant Christian society. It's not entirely Christian. There's indigenous peoples, different sects of Christianity. And of course, there are different peoples too. So there was a Fulani-dominated north, and then you had the Yoruba and Igbo in the southwest and southeast, respectively. Now, when the British put these areas together, because they were all sort of different protectorates is what they called them. But in the post-war period, post-World War I that is, they grouped them all together into one unitary entity called Nigeria. but there was no historical basis for this thing. But they put them together for a couple of reasons. One, it was administratively useful. It was cheap to administer in this way, and it also made sure that there would be different factions within Nigeria that would balance off each other and make it easier for the British to control them. This was a very common strategy that they had used all over the world. And their experience in India in particular had led them to be very trepidatious in terms of allowing too much missionary activity in predominantly Muslim areas, talking about things like the Indian Mutiny. So they deliberately restricted Christian missionaries from going into the north. Now, this had a lot of important long-term consequences because it meant that the Christian communities in the north were always much, much smaller. And if you're a smaller community, you are at risk. You're at risk. If you're a minority community, you're automatically at risk. It doesn't mean something necessarily bad will happen to you, but it does mean that if things do turn against you, you're going to be not in a position of being able to defend yourself.
Sure.
So independence comes in the 1960s, and it's very fragile. Much like many experiences of decolonization, there was a lot of instability. We're talking about building institutions, whole cloth. And unfortunately, there were a series of coups in the late 1960s, barely a few years into the democratic experiment. And this led to a lot of bloodshed, violence, mistrust, and an attempt at secession. This was the Biafran secession in the southeast there. This was opposed by the southwest and north of the country. These are the elites and the military fighting each other. About 1 million people were killed, mostly due to famine. But that has had a long-term impact on the memory and experience and the story of the people of that region. And this is where a lot of the oil wealth is. So this is one of the reasons that the other parts of Nigeria were so resistant to what would have been Biafra breaking away, is because that oil revenue is a big part of the spoils system. This is how, when the military took control of the country during that period and held it together and tried to centralize it, this was how they managed it. They shared out oil revenues in order to create a patronage network.
And now that also includes liquid natural gas.
Yes, and now that includes liquid natural gas. Yeah. And so Nigeria was able to democratize. Nigeria was able to re-democratize, much like many decolonial experiences. There was a period of military rule and then successful re-democratization. This happened in 1999. Unfortunately, right away, when you looked at what political parties emerged, they were very clearly along sectional lines right away. And so when you have a central government, Nigeria is supposed to be a federal system, a very strongly federal system. But in actual point of practice, it tends to be much more centralized. And so having control of the central government is important because you control spoils. And so that's kind of where we wound up today. And there are some very important things that are driving the violence against Christians today that tie into this. Number one is there was never the same amount of economic development in the North that there was in the South. This led to, and again, this was deliberate British policy, and then long periods of war and military control, and just their way of life. There's been a lot of desertification, which is pushing these herders southwards into the Middle Belt, and they're coming into conflict.
Help people understand a little bit. The herders are primarily
Fulani Muslims.
Mm-hmm. And the farmers that we'll be talking about later are primarily Christians. In that same region.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes. And so some of this is clashes over land usage. Some of this is clashes over land usage, but it's intersecting on a number of levels, as you said, because there is a strong religious and ethnic divide that's going on here. And when the country democratized, there was a group in the north who wanted nothing to do with secular politics, and this was Boko Haram, which was formed in 2002. Now, initially, this group was nonviolent. They were radical, hard-edged, almost like Salafis, to draw a parallel to what we kind of know from our experience in the Middle East. But in 2009, there was a crackdown, and Mohammed Yusuf, who had started the group, was extrajudicially executed by government forces. And as so often happens, when you crack down, it drives the moderates out and it radicalizes the hardliners who remain. And this is when the new leadership embraced terrorism, suicide bombing, kidnapping. And the situation has gotten worse and worse. And of course, part of the group splintered in, I believe, 2013 and pledged allegiance to ISIS, so ISWAP. So now you have multiple factions who are warring. And of course, this has led to local groups arming to protect themselves, because the Nigerian central government is it lacks state capacity. I think we can say with some confidence it lacks state capacity, and it's also very nervous about trying to intervene in this way because it could spark a civil war where maybe parts of the army turn on each other and creates an even bigger problem.
There are 200 million people in the country, and when you say lack state capacity, I think a lot of things are relative, because relative to other nations in the region, it has a lot of state, capacity, maybe not relative to some other democratic institutions. But, if, it's recognized, obviously, as a state, it's a democratic republic. And so we here over on this side of the pond have some interest in the fact that it is a democratic republic and preserving it as a democratic republic because of the stability that can provide. Let me ask you a little bit about you talked about the Fulani herdsmen. They don't actually own the properties, but the Christians actually own the properties. And at one point, and I don't have a whole lot of familiarity, because this is not my area of expertise, but maybe you can help us if you have some background in it. At one time, it seemed there seemed to be a détente. There seemed to be a kind of, we can work together because we farm at one time of the year. We bring our herds through at a different time of year. We can actually work this out. And for a time, it's my understanding that there was within their own community, within their own culture, they made it work. What happened, if you can talk to that?
Well, as I said, I think it's an intensification of all the forces that we were talking about. The economy has done increasingly poorly. There's been an increasing lack of pastoral land that's usable up there. There's also been an intensification of violence in those areas. And frankly, Muslims have also been the target of these extremists, and they don't really want to be there either.
Right.
It's leading to more and more people being crowded into these same areas. And the kinds of compromises that you were talking about, that is the only way forward, but that takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of empathy, understanding, consideration, and these are qualities that, of course, as Christians, we hold to be supreme, but they are also things that take a lot of work.
Yeah.
And in situations of incredible violence and stress and hardship and potential danger, those aren't always the qualities that win out.
Yeah. I want to move to our next.
Yeah, Omoneh, why don't you tell us about some of the broader sociological impacts that are, being put upon different communities in Nigeria?
Okay, so the current situation in Nigeria is spotlighted right now as a religious conflict. And first of all, I want to speak to the religious makeup of Nigeria. So right now, it's like 50% Muslim, 49% Christian, and then 1% the traditional religion. And as we know by now, the Muslims are mostly in the north, and then the Christians mostly dominate the southern parts. So a lot of the reasons for the conflicts are kind of intersected. So it is an economic conflict in the sense that right now, this is kind of a response to whatever economic reality that we are facing in the country right now. So it does have a lot of impact on the communities in terms of like the displacement that goes on. So families also flee the villages and farms, which kind of lead to a rising number of displaced people, especially among the Middle Belt area. So when you talk about states like Benue State and Yobe, and those are mostly the states that tend to be affected. And right now it tends to be leaning more southwest, so more situations in states like Ondo, and that kind of disrupts a lot of the education systems here. So schools tend to also close after attacks such as these. So a major case that we talk about when we talk about this situation is like the case of the Chibok girls, for example, or recently the attacks that happened this year on some Christian churches in Nigeria. And for Nigerians who are trying to understand the situation and what is going on, it's kind of a mix between understanding that this situation needs to be spotlighted in order to be talked about so that people can understand and have awareness of what's going on, and a kind of protection of, I think, the sovereignty of Nigeria as its own state. So there is a lot of fragmented response towards like what is going on and what people actually want to see of the situation, like how they want to see it become better. So not all of the violence is religious, but Christian communities are often very disproportionately affected because Christian communities in specific regions are also affected by the church burnings and village raids and like the targets, and the pattern is more complex and there are more motivations that tend to lean more political and economic. So that's all I have to add.
Okay, thank you very much. Will, why don't you tell us about your experience as a former U.S. diplomat?
And I served as a diplomat in West Africa and also as the senior advisor to the State Department for mass atrocities. And one of our particular focus at the time, because I was in West Africa during those civil wars in 1999 and in the early 2000s, and most recently as the senior advisor for mass atrocities, one of our focuses was on this area of northern Nigeria. And it was so funny that, you come in and you do a little bit of research on the internet and how quickly, this is either, religious persecution or no, this is all just about, geography and who gets to use the land and oh, no, it's not about either. It's just really about bandits that are kidnapping people so that they can, get some money from people that have means that can pay the ransom. And over about 15 years, I started to see there's some Venn diagrams here. And it's very, very complicated. It's not one of any of things, but it's actually all of those things that are happening. And so I think one of the most important things, we need to do is, in any particular situation, figure out what's really happening here. Do we have some bandits that don't give a hoot about any religion? They just want to make some quick money? Or do we have some bandits that are being, radicalized by Boko Haram? Or are we dealing with, some other political thing that's going on? And I was actively involved in some of the kidnappings that you talked about with regard to resolving, and we were able to rescue some of those young Muslim boys because it's not just Christians that sometimes get kidnapped. Sometimes it's people of all faiths, and so it is primarily Christians here. And let's make sure we understand that. There's the numbers are staggering and from just the legitimate sources. And look at the legitimate sources that are reporting the number of Christians that have died because of their faith, and it's staggering the number of families that have been forcibly removed, from their homes. But let's also at the same time, when we're looking at those staggering numbers, know that it's not just Christians. Sometimes it's people of other faiths as well. And so this is a complicated problem. What is the motivation in each particular situation? Is that what I want to know? But where I come back to good governance and the rule of law. You spoke about a little bit earlier is, we have a constitutional republic there. And is it a fully functional state? Absolutely not. But are they at a place where they can, as a government, be expected to do the one thing the government is supposed to do, and that's protect its citizen? I think yes. I think that the citizens of Nigeria have a right to, demand that, whether those citizens be of whatever, faith they are. What is the American interest here? And the current administration, I think, sees most of its foreign policy through what is in the American interest. And so I saw I can't tell you the amount of fraud I saw through USAID programs and bad money being thrown after bad programs, along with the really good things that those kind of programs, were doing. And so what somebody somewhere has decided is we're going to look at foreign policy through a different lens on this side of the pond, and that is what's in the American interest. Well, we've got a huge interest in Nigeria succeeding. There's 200 million people there. It is, for better or worse, it is the state that affects all of the surrounding nations in West Africa. If Nigeria becomes a failed state, it will, in my view, probably become a dictatorship. And whether it's a religious dictatorship under Islamic rule or some other kind of dictatorship under some kind of type of mob rule, it would inevitably go into a dictatorship that is very, very dangerous for the stability of that entire region. Not to mention, somebody brought up the oil, the amount of oil that is produced in that country, and the number of and the amount of liquid natural gas. It is a significant impact on world markets. And if you have a stable nation where the people of that nation, whether they be Muslim in the north or Christian in the south, can trust the government to protect all citizens as, I'll say this from a Christian perspective, as made in the image of God, and therefore being worthy and of being treated with dignity and respect, and therefore protected by its government, you'll have stability in the economic markets. And if you don't have stability in the economic markets, that doesn't just hurt Nigeria. It hurts the entire world. It hurts all of Europe. It hurts the entire world. And so I think that there is a lot that the Nigerian government can do to prevent some of these forced removal of families from their property. But it has to be done in these killings. But it has to be done with a kind of legitimacy, and it can't have legitimacy if it's not being done in a fair way. And so whether a person is Muslim, Christian, or something else, the government needs to be treating everybody as equal under the rule of law. And that's, once again, we've talked about in this program, the importance of the rule of law to good governance, and the importance of the rule of law to protecting the free exercise of religious conscience, no matter what your faith is. And so I think if Nigeria lives up to its constitutional duty, it can prevent state failure. If it fails to do it, I think it has the very, very realistic danger of becoming a failed state. And so what does that mean for religious leaders around the world, and in particularly Nigerian religious leaders? Religious leaders across Nigeria, I think, should continue to sustain a united, and I'm going to say this in the best way I can, interfaith condemnation of violence. I don't care what your faith is. You can all come together on agreement. There ought not be violence based on a person's religious conscience. And I think some of the Christian models that are going on in Nigeria right now that are expressing explicit concern for Muslim victims is modeling the only kind of moral posture that's going to be capable of preventing a sectarian implosion. And so I think if we do this and we document the incidents carefully, dates, locations, names, and have the kind of evidentiary detail that makes it irrefutable of what is going on, you can eventually, achieve domestic and international accountability mechanisms that are necessary to, have a basis for your protection of all of your citizens. And so I would love to see I would love to see Christians, the heart of Jesus, just explode over there, where we can tell the truth in love without fear, and in a way that leads to repentance and reform. I think that the constitutional order there can be restored. I think there's hope for it. I have increased hope now that the eyes of the international community, and not just some people like you and I at this table that have familiarity with it, the whole world is looking at Nigeria right now. And, the nation there has the ability to step up and say, we are a sovereign state. They may not like that other people are looking at them, but okay, people will stop looking at you if we do the right thing.
Sure.
And I think we should support the sovereignty of every nation, including Nigeria. And I think one of the ways, that we do that is by shining the light, on what is happening over there, just like they and everybody else in the world are free to shine the light on, maybe areas that the United States can improve upon. And so I just like to see that heart of Jesus again emerge, because when I spent time in West Africa, and particularly in the various parts of Nigeria, when you see, and maybe you can help me with this because you're from there, if you go to church in Nigeria, you're going to a special place because Jesus shows up every day, every time you're there. And when you walk out of that church and then you listen to his Great Commission, I have hope. I have hope for the nation if we can fiercely be unafraid to stand for truth, but do it in the way that Jesus calls us to do it with compassion and do it with the respect that is always required. That's where we get back to the place where the Fulani herdsmen, primarily Muslim, can live in peace with the Christians who are the farmers on that land. They've done it before, I know, and so let's get back to where we can do it again. That's my prayer. That's my hope.
Yeah. I think you bring up a good point, too. We've talked about this on other podcasts, too, about, kind of shining the light on the issue. That's the biggest first step we can take right now. First is prayer, and then after that comes making people aware there's an issue in the first place. Yeah. And so I think that, when we are looking at the situation in Nigeria, something we do at the Faith and Freedom Center here, for those of you listening, if you go to faithandfreedomcenter.org/persecution, we have a webpage dedicated to Christian persecution around the world. It's got our latest stories that talk about Christian persecution, the different facts and statistics about Christian persecution globally, as well as a historical timeline. That's kind of my brainchild of, putting together all the lists throughout history of Christian groups who have been persecuted. And so, by drawing attention to the issue in general, by doing the podcast right now that we are sitting down and doing, and by spreading the issue and the topic to other people, I think that's how we go about, getting that Jesus back into the culture like you just talked about.
Yeah. Good. Well, do you guys have any final thoughts before we go to our final wrap here today?
I did want to speak a little bit on international engagements and what that should look like.
Sure.
So from us, we are speaking from the US and from the perspective that we have right now. And I do think that it is important to bring these kinds of issues to light and just make sure that when we are talking about it, we understand that the issue is more than just what one headline shows, and taking the effort and the time to dissect the issue and read more about it. That's really helpful. And I think in Nigeria, what is really needed is a strengthening of civilian protection. So a lot of the reasons why a lot of populations in these middle belt areas are vulnerable in the first place is because of, the lack of protection for their own land ownership or their home. And I think it is important to invest in the livelihoods of these people so that we can continue to stabilize on our own and build security for ourselves as time goes on. So yeah, I think also amplifying the voices of people who do want to see a positive change in the country, I think that would be very helpful in spreading the sentiment that there is hope for the country in general.
Yeah.
So
a hand up instead of a hand out. When I was, over there, one of the biggest mistakes that I felt the American nation would make from time to time is they would show up with millions of dollars and said, "Oh, we're here, we're here to help." And then they would begin to undermine the sovereignty of whatever nation they were in by saying, "This is how you're going to spend the dollars," as opposed to getting on the ground and talking to the folks that are there and working with the folks who actually know the problem because they're living the problem, and then working together to solve the problem while you respect the sovereignty, of the nation that you're an allied with at the time. So.
Well, I certainly agree, and I think we can kind of divide this up into two things. So first, there's shining a light on what's going on there, and in terms of what U.S. government policy can do is I think it's important to highlight the transnational aspect of this violence. There are large amounts of arms that are flowing into this country from the north through the Sahel, from Libya, which was the product of a terrible military intervention. There's also a lot of arms coming in from Sudan, again, another long-running conflict. So there can be efforts to curb transnational arm flows, but we need to recognize the transnational aspect of it. We also need to recognize that there are certain actors within the Nigerian state that are not going to buy in to the government. And you need government buy-in from the major stakeholders. And so a group like Boko Haram, whatever path might have happened 20 years ago, I think it needs to be recognized now that this is not a group that is going to buy in to a secular, stable, tolerant Nigeria. And so there needs to be, as you said, outreach, especially by the religious leaders who can stand up and say, we condemn all violence. That's very important.
The conscience of the nation, if you will.
That's very important. And then you need to provide the strength and security forces that require, as I said, there's a difference, I think, between state capacity and maybe realized state capacity, because certainly Nigeria is not lacking in material resources, but it does have a major corruption problem, which translates into a lack of initiative in terms of protecting property, and because that's important too. Is there's if someone does something to our property, we can be very confident that we can get recompense. That is just not the case, and so there are all sorts of carry-on effects there that people aren't investing the way that they would because their property is insecure, and this is leading to more negative long-term effects. So we want to definitely try and shine a spotlight on the violence and the corruption, encourage our faith leaders to condemn this violence, and to do what we can, certainly as the most powerful state in all of human history, to not make the situation worse. Just look at all the states surrounding poor Nigeria right now and what's happening. And we can't pretend like the influence only goes one way, that Nigeria has a large impact on these. All of what's happening there is having a terribly negative impact on Nigeria, which is in a difficult situation, and it's a young republic. And you can speak to this. When I did our lectures on Nigeria, I feel very positive about Nigeria. I think there's a lot good in Nigeria.
Yeah, because that power transition I remember you talking about, it was the first time when, it was military control, then a Democratic Party took control, and then they handed over power.
They inherited a very difficult situation, and they're only 25 years in. And I think things have gotten a little worse over probably the last 10 to 12 years, but a lot of that wasn't really Nigeria's fault. It was things that were coming into the country from outside. And so if Nigeria can stay together, which I think is very important, I don't think any of the examples where African states have split up or had secession movements like Somalia or Sudan, I don't think any of those provide a model that Nigeria wants to emulate. And so, if they can just hang in there and work through this, I think the future is very bright for Nigeria.
Well, it's interesting. When I was on the federal bench, I did a diplomatic mission to West Africa. And I was speaking with a judge over dinner and on the corruption issue that you bring up. He says, "Oh, Judge Wagner, you don't understand. We would never take a bribe in a criminal case. Somebody's liberty's at stake. We only take bribes in civil cases." And I was like, and the judge was a Christian, and so I stopped for a moment. I said, "Now wait a minute. Let's just step back a second. Listen to what you just said. It sounds logically rational, but is it right? Let's ask a deeper question. Is it right or is it wrong?" And then he smiled, and the smile kind of went to well, you're right. He sheepishly admitted that, okay, we have to go back to a place where we recognize what is right and what is wrong. This has been I think it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you guys being here today. And when we come back, we'll do what we call the final wrap.
Growing deep roots means anchoring yourself to Jesus Christ, the source of all life and learning. Here at Spring Arbor University, faith and academics work hand in hand, grounding you in truth and wisdom. With a close-knit Christian community by your side, you'll grow strong, ready to face life's challenges. At SAU, you won't just learn, you'll thrive. Grow deep roots at Spring Arbor University. Visit arbor.edu today.
All right, and now the final wrap. What a very, very enlightening conversation with some, very, very smart folks today, and I really appreciate them joining us. What I want to do in our close here is take and summarize it all. I think what we need to do maybe is, once again, tell the truth in love without fear, and seek to get repentance, which will lead to the reform that some of us were talking about and hoping for today. That is in the finest traditions of a constitutional order. Why? Because it recognizes human dignity as not something that is just given to us by government, but rather that government exists to secure that human dignity. And so it is right that Christians around the world shine the light on it and seek to elevate it, and that the world should hear it. And I would suggest even that Nigerian leaders should heed it. A nation cannot be stable while large portions of its people are living in terror and in fear just because of the God or how they worship. And so the path from the fragility that we were talking about earlier today to the kind of stability that we are hoping for here today runs through the idea that we're all made equally in the eyes of God, that we must lawfully restrain violence, and we must have a renewed commitment to Nigeria's constitutional promise. Silence, in my view, is no longer an option. Justice is the only durable peace. I am so happy to see that the light of truth and justice is being shined on these issues with the kind of compassion and respect that we would hope for, and I hope that that continues. And so until next time, this is Professor William Wagner for Faith and for Freedom and for such a time as this.